Demonstrators rallied outside the West Roxbury courthouse today in support of two people who were arrested over the weekend while protesting against a white supremacist rally outside a drag queen story hour in Jamaica Plain. The state did drop charges against those two this morning, but the state is moving forward with a charge against a third person arrested Saturday, Chris Hood, founder of the neo-Nazi group NSC 131. That's a group he formed because Patriot Front, whose members marched through downtown Boston a few weeks back, were not quite aggressive enough in their fascism, by Hood's estimation. State prosecutors also asked a judge to order Hood to stay out of Suffolk County, a request the judge denied today. But after the two white supremacist demonstrations this month, plus an NSC 131 protest at the St. Patrick's Day Parade in March, and a neo-Nazi protest at Brigham and Women's Hospital in February, Suffolk County DA Kevin Hayden announced today he's adding 2 additional hate crimes prosecutors to his team, saying, quote, "It's clear to me that Massachusetts and Boston have become target destinations for groups that spread hate." U.S. Attorney Rachael Rollins also released a statement yesterday saying in part, quote, "We need to expose these cowards." To that end, Rollins said she is creating a dedicated hotline over the coming weeks that people will be able to call with information about white supremacist activity in the region. I'm joined by GBH News senior investigative reporter Phillip Martin, who's been reporting on the growth of white supremacist groups nationally and here in Massachusetts for several months. We're also joined by Robert Trestan, executive director of the Anti-Defamation League's Boston office. Good to see you both. Thank you for being here. Phillip, can you start off by telling me and viewers a little more about why Chris Hood left Patriot Front to set up NSC 131? Was it a difference in what those groups hope to achieve, or is it a difference in tactics, or maybe a combination of both those things?
Well, you have to look at Chris Hood is someone who craves attention. So does his organization. The Patriot Front also craves attention. His organization, Chris Hood, NSC 131, it's said that he was kicked out of the Patriot Front for theft, that he also had problems with another group that he had belonged to called the Base. Now, a lot of this is not particularly important on a micro level, but it goes to show you that these groups, although they share the common white supremacist views and viewpoints, that their tactics differ somewhat. The Patriot Front attempts to project a message that might be more accepting to mainstream, if you will, conservative, and even far-right individuals, where they talk about reclaiming America as opposed to saying explicitly, we want to create a white ethno state, which is their goal. The Chris Hood and the neo-Nazi group that he helped form, NSC 131, they are explicit in their fascism. And that is perhaps the only difference between the two groups. And that they, on one level, they compete for attention, as Robert can explain further. On the other instance, they sometimes collude on matters such as the concept of white lives matter.
Okay, that's a great, thank you for that primer. As you say, you don't want to get too down in the weeds, but in a way, by getting down in the weeds, you can highlight those key commonalities that you've just touched on. One more question for you, Phillip, before we go to Robert. After Charles Morrell was attacked earlier this month, the city of Boston was sharply criticized for not being ready to respond to that attack and not doing enough. I should say seeming attack, I haven't seen the video, but he says he was assaulted by members of Patriot Front, and for not being ready to respond to the march that brought them to Copley Square. I want to read a bit from the Reverend Kevin Peterson of the New Democracy Coalition, who had a scathing assessment. He said, "It's mind-boggling to me that a group of 100 children of the KKK were allowed to march across the span of the city from Haymarket into this area of Back Bay without appropriate police presence or surveillance." Over the weekend, when NSC 131 showed up at this drag queen story hour in Jamaica Plain, my understanding is that the BPD was on hand and was ready to monitor what was happening and respond to it. Does that indicate a shift in how seriously the city of Boston is taking this activity?
Perhaps. I think that there has been a degree of seriousness from some law enforcement officials even before this. When I say some, I'm not saying all. I think that U.S. Attorney Rachael Rollins, I think, has been very serious about this and has been trying to formulate how to respond. The same can be said of Mayor Wu, again, trying to formulate how to respond. I think they were seriously taken by surprise by the Patriot Front march. That doesn't mean that they should not have been ready, because these activities have been going on for a long time. We have to go back to a time when there was people happened to get a glimpse of computers at the state police headquarters during the marches by Black Lives Matter and Antifa members. And we saw on those desks, on the computers, that they were monitoring Antifa. And so you have to wonder if they're paying the same amount of attention to neo-fascists, Patriot Front, NSC 131, as they have been to anti-fascists who've been militating against these groups for a long time.
Yeah, that's a question that I've been asking myself. Robert, I want to get you, if you can, to situate what's happening here in Massachusetts in a broader national context. The ADL said, I believe it was earlier this year, that in the previous calendar year, Massachusetts was the fourth most active state when it comes to the dissemination of white supremacist propaganda. Why do you think that is the case? Why have we become something of a hotspot for this?
Well, some of the answer to that is actually in what Phillip was just talking about, in the differences between NSC and Patriot Front. Because NSC, their focus is New England. They were founded in Worcester. And so where Patriot Front may have a national footprint, NSC is exclusively focused on the New England states, including Massachusetts. So when we actually drill down, we see that probably upwards of around 80% of the dissemination of white supremacist content within our community is really only a couple of groups that are dominating it. And this is one of those groups. So I think it's really important for us to recognize, whereas Patriot Front, they traveled from all over the country, based in Texas, heavy presence in other states. NSC is here. They live amongst us. And that's why this response you're seeing is so important.
You know, I'm really glad that you brought that to the fore, because in some of the commentary that I've seen, people seem to suggest that this is more a case of outsiders coming here because they believe that Boston or Massachusetts is overly inclusive or overly welcoming, and they see it as a target for that reason. So being reminded that it's not just people from outside, but people who are living in this state who have these beliefs strikes me as really important. Robert, we mentioned at the beginning that the Suffolk DA, currently Kevin Hayden's doubling the number of prosecutors that he has working on civil rights cases, that U.S. Attorney Rollins is going to be rolling out a hotline to report activity like this. Are there steps that they or other people in power could be taking right now to respond to this uptick that are not being taken that you think are important?
Well, I think the steps that you mentioned are absolutely critical. One of the things that we know is these groups frequently change their tactics. So whereas at one point we may know that they're coming in advance and BPD may plan the route and have a lot of communication, they're using this sort of flash protests right now. So I think it's equally important that law enforcement, they need to have tactics and be prepared where they may show up without notice. And so they need to make those same adaptations. Now, it's not necessarily all about free speech, because we do know that these groups, they do their own combat training. If it's about free speech, why were they doing combat training in Wakefield last month? So we need to ensure that our tactics are keeping up with them, and we need to use the law to the maximum advantage of for the community. And that's what we're seeing happen right now.
Phillip, I want to go back to the encounter that Charles Morrell, the Boston artist, had with Patriot Front in Copley Square. He says he was assaulted by them. The photos that I have seen certainly seem to bear that out. Is anyone going to be charged in connection with that case? Do we know what's going on?
We do know that the Boston police and BRIC are looking through the photos to see, to basically try to determine if someone can be charged.
That's the Boston Regional Intelligence Center. We should mention a sort of a
That's
consortium
correct.
of law enforcement. Yeah.
Correct. And the FBI is also looking through those photos, trying to determine if someone can be charged. Now, one problem with the interpretation of, there are actually two problems with the interpretation of what happened. One is there were definitely police present, contrary to a statement that had been made earlier. I've gone back and looked at the video and the photos, and there were police in the area, perhaps not right at that moment where Merle was allegedly assaulted, but they were definitely there. And so that's one issue. The other issue, Adam, is that the situation was a little more nuanced than we might imagine. Without question, this man was assaulted, but he was basically speaking out against these individuals, feeling affronted by their presence in this town. White supremacists marching down the street without any type of opposition or visible monitoring, in his view and many others' view, by police. 100 individuals with shields, heavy shields, which can be used as weapons, marching down the street. And Charles Merle definitely confronted them.
So when you say it was nuanced, but also say he was definitely assaulted, I mean, the one image I'm thinking of, there's one where he's assumed what almost looks like a Christ-type pose, but there's another where he's being pressed against a pole by these guys whose faces are masked, who, as you mentioned, are carrying riot shields.
That's right.
You've looked at the photos, you've sized up what happened. Does it seem to you that assault charges would be appropriate?
I think so. I think so. The assault charges, without question, are appropriate. There's no doubt about that. What I was referencing, I'm sorry. Go on, Robert.
Yeah, hop in, Robert.
So keep in mind that we all have the right, the civil right, to walk down the street without someone blocking our way because of the color of our skin or any other characteristic. So it's an assault. But I would say that, there may be some civil rights issues that are associated with that assault as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
that's right.
That's actually that's a factor I hadn't thought of that could be involved in making the potential prosecution more complicated. I want to ask you both about the NSC 131 disruption of the Drag Queen Story Hour in JP. They went after, again, a drag queen story hour. That's the same thing that Rayla Campbell, who is going to be the Republican nominee for Secretary of State, did in the town of Holbrook earlier this year at the public library there. Let's take a little bit of a look at the video that she filmed of herself showing up at this event in Holbrook.
We would love for this to end. We would love for this to end. Our taxpayer dollars
very clear.
Yeah, and you should see the books. Oh, I'm hateful and bigoted about the books that show child pornography that are available in this library.
Where? Show me the child pornography available.
Why don't you read Gender
library.
Queer? I've already been showing everybody about it. Or how about let's talk about it? Let's talk about it. I'm protecting children.
If this is not protecting
I'm protecting children. Nope, I'm protecting children. Is this person been Corey checked? Has this person been Corey checked?
So the close there is her asking if the drag queen who is performing or conducting the story hour has had a criminal records check done. Very similar rhetoric to what we saw from NSC 131. Pedo scum off our streets. We're protecting children from sexual threat. I'd like to get both your takes. Does calling the groups like this extremist minimize the extent to which their worldview has gone mainstream? Robert, why don't you start? And then Philip, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think there's some distinctions between what the clip you just showed and a group that's doing combat training and is sort of espoused white supremacy. And, every week they seem to be targeting a different group. Look, everybody's got a right to their opinion and their free speech rights. When you start to cross the line and interfere with others, it's going to be a problem.
Well, I hear you about the differences, but there's also a really important commonality. NSC 131 and Rayla Campbell in the two cases that I'm talking about here, both went after drag queen story hours under the pretext of protecting children from non-existent sexual harm. And that strikes me as a really significant affinity. Phillip, do you think that labeling groups focusing on the stuff that sets them apart, for example, the combat training, undersells the extent to which a lot of, for example, Republicans here in Massachusetts might appreciate their rhetoric on some issues?
I would say Republicans in Massachusetts and across the country, there's a symbiosis that's occurring that we should be totally aware of. And we should, because you can see it across the country, where the Texas Republican Party, for example, is carrying out a mainstream campaign, if you will, against LGBTQ rights, including trans people. And the same thing is true in Massachusetts, where there's a symbiotic relationship. They may not agree on tactics, NSC 131 and some right-wing politicians, but they have basically glommed onto the same issues in order to try to amplify their message. And it is a message of hate. It is a message of that is directed at LGBTQ communities, at communities of color. They glom onto various issues. LGBTQ issues are one. Critical race theory, or what they call critical race theory, is another, for example. So you see this happening, that amplification happening across the country.
I want to ask Robert the closing question, and I think it's a big one. Robert, we saw in Jamaica Plain counter-protesters show up to confront NSC 131. Initial reports suggested that they got into a physical conflict with NSC 131. Apparently the charges against them have now been dropped. But what counsel would you give to people who may see groups like this being active in the public square, be appalled by what they're doing, and want to indicate their disapproval in some helpful way, rather than in a way that is potentially damaging or incendiary? What would you suggest?
Well, I would caution people against confronting them. They're often looking for a confrontation, and their tactics are designed to provoke confrontation. So I think a direct physical confrontation should be discouraged. But in the same way that they have a right to speak publicly of their views, so does the community, and so do the individuals. And I think, our voices are one of the most powerful tools we have, particularly when it comes to issues around hate. Okay. And so it's certainly encourage people to use that really important tool that we all have.
All right, Robert Trestan of the ADL, Phillip Martin of GBH, thank you both for talking this through.
Thank you.